Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the penultimate webinar in Con Maciel Carey's 2019 OSHA webinar series. We are delighted today, well, actually, I take that back. We are here today to talk about process safety management. I'm a little less than delighted to be talking about it after being up very, very late last night working on a brief about process safety management filed in the 10th Circuit last night in a significant case. But it's on our mind, and so it's perfect timing to be talking about this process safety update. This is Eric Kahn. I'm the chair of the OSHA practice group at Con Maciel Carey. I'm joined today by my partners Micah Smith and Amanda Walker and our associate Bita Lashkari. And we are going to get into some really interesting updates. This really has been a hot area of OSHA and environmental law with updates and activities on the enforcement and rulemaking front all over the place. So lots of good stuff to talk about today. I'll introduce myself briefly, let my colleagues introduce themselves. We'll go over the agenda and we'll dig in. As I said, I'm one of the founding partners of the firm and chair of the OSHA practice. I represent employers in all aspects of workplace safety and health law, from inspections, investigations, to enforcement actions, proactive program and policy building and auditing, and handling the full range of litigation, from contesting OSHA citations, from appeals out to the federal circuit courts, and now, unfortunately, a more meaningful component of our practice is assisting with criminal investigations and prosecutions, as that has become a bigger area of workplace safety law. Let's have some of my colleagues introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Micah Smith. I'm a partner here at Con Maciel's National OSHA Workplace Safety Practice Group. I'm excited to be here. Everything that Eric said that he does, I do that too. I won't give you the full rundown again, but I've been fortunate enough to have a specialty in the PSM space, working for refineries, chemical manufacturers, and other PSM-covered entities. So I am excited to be talking more about PSM and RMP today.
Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Walker, and I'm also a partner with Con Maciel's OSHA Group, and I am based out of Atlanta. And like my colleague said, I focus exclusively on OSHA, maybe a little EPA when it overlaps with OSHA, and help clients with the full range of compliance assistance to handling investigations and then the litigation that results after that. I got my start in this field with starting off working at OSHA, and then made my way over to private practice, where I'm currently helping employers navigate OSHA. Thank you.
Great. Hi all, my name is Bita Lashkari, and I am an associate at Con Maciel Carey and a former attorney investigator at the Chemical Safety Board. And I represent employers in the full range of matters regarding the OSH Act and handle the full range of litigation related to contesting citations issued by OSHA. And I also manage inspections and investigations by OSHA, the CSB, EPA, and state and local regulators.
All right, with that, we'll move on, get things started here. Apologies, I got the slides in the wrong order. So we'll scroll around a little bit and get things set up. All right, quick run through of what we're covering today. We are going to talk first about rulemaking, both under EPA and OSHA's jurisdiction. We'll follow that up with a discussion of, in particular, OSHA's efforts to expand PSM coverage. Following that with a discussion of the current ongoing national emphasis program that OSHA has going for chemical plants and petroleum refineries, and we will round things out with a discussion on some of the movements on criminal prosecutions, the developments there among the agencies. So with that, I'll jump back to my place in the slides and kick it off with the RMP amendments. I will apologize in advance for any of you that have attended our webinars or presentations over the last couple of years. You know, sometimes you give a presentation on a topic and you're rushing to get the slides ready and thinking, I've got to present now, this issue is moving, we got to get the information out there so everybody knows what to do. And usually when you think that's the case, you do it, you get it out there, and it's great. Other times you hurry to get the content out there and think, all right, in a few months I'll update this and we'll see where the issue goes. This has not been that sort of a case. It's been a little more like watching a car accident in slow motion, and it just keeps going on and on. So don't let me betray how I feel about the RMP amendments, but let's kick it off with an overview of the rulemaking. So again, apologies for anyone who's heard this before. We'll keep it fairly brief. Following the incident in West Texas, the fertilizer explosion, President Obama signed an executive order ordering a collection of agencies to take actions to reform, update, modernize their rules. In response to that, EPA, OSHA responded as well, but EPA in particular responded by 2014 issuing a request for information on some of the ideas that they had for potential expansion or amendments for the RMP rule. This, you'll see from our slide, we characterize this as a very rushed rulemaking because after the request for information, within a year or so, they were already off and running with the small business review. Over the course of that process and other comments solicited, EPA cut the proposed or the possible 21 RMP elements down to 6. And in March 2016, we had a publication of the proposed rule. Now, what was unique about that is that they published the proposed rule before the SBAR report was finalized. So if you want to believe that they fully considered the effect on small businesses, you're free to believe that, and I've got a bridge to sell you anytime you're available. So industry, of course, was very involved in this rulemaking, wanted to get as much information as possible and to give it a tremendous amount of input, and there were extension requests made frequently asking EPA to slow down, let everyone take a breath and get some input and think about what was happening. Those extension requests were denied at every stage. The rule was rushed to OMB for an expedited final review or approval, and it was finalized in the last few days of the Obama administration, January 2017. It was slated to become effective in March. And so, again, we call this a rushed rulemaking. I know that for most people in the world, 3.5 years from start to finish isn't rushed, but believe me, in administrative agencies, that's fast. That's lightning speed. All right, what happened with the rule that was ultimately published? It had 6 major elements. We've got them listed up here. These are the major ones that made it through into the final rule. If you're familiar with these, you can see how these had a major effect on the rule as it was applied before. We had a tweak to compliance audits, changing when they were required, who you're required to be involved with them. Those are all potentially significant changes. We had some changes to incident investigations, a requirement that companies begin to use a specific method where they identify a root cause, rather than having just open-ended ability to do incident investigations. Then we saw some changes that would show up in the PHA context with safer technology alternatives analysis. Then we had a couple of emergency response related things related to coordination, planning exercises, and also public information sharing. All right, so final rules published in January 2017, slated to begin enforcement in March of 2017. As if anyone who follows the news knows, there was a presidential election in 2017 and a new president sworn in early 2017. It was a tumultuous time in the administrative context with lots of movement between Congress taking action for a lot of the so-called midnight rules pushed out by the Obama administration, and then also the White House getting involved in some of these administrative contexts. So we had a lot of things happen over the first few months. Congress made a couple of, I'll call them weak attempts to repeal the RMP amendments using the Congressional Review Act. Those never got really anywhere, didn't even get off the ground. So the rule survived those attempts on it. Immediately after the rule was finalized, industry and a number of states petitioned EPA to stay and reconsider. There were also some lawsuits filed elsewhere that we'll get down to in a minute. Industry filed challenges to the amendments directly, so we have a challenge both to stay and then also challenging the rule in its substantive aspects. Those are filed in February and March. In the light of all of this flurry of litigation, EPA proposed a rule that would delay the implementation from early 2017 all the way out until February 2019. They requested comments on that. They reviewed comments in April and May 2017, and in June 2017 they published a final rule, we'll call it the delay rule, that pushed off the effective date of the RMP amendments all the way out into 2019. So for those of you following along at home, sorry I don't have a telestrator to keep you up to date. On the books at this point, we have the RMP amendments, which is the rule that would impose new requirements on employers. We also have a delay rule, which would purport to delay the imposition of the requirements of the RMP amendments for nearly 2 years. All right, so keep those two rules in mind. There are more coming. The delay rule was immediately challenged by environmental groups, alleging that EPA had not followed proper procedures in issuing the rule, and that there was no basis for doing so. Things kept moving. Right, we mentioned that in 2017, the delay rule was made final, and then the litigation started. Nothing much happened for a while. EPA intended this. They gave themselves enough space to think about what to do. And what they decided to do was to issue another rule called the reconsideration rule. That's our third rule that we're talking about here. And in that rule, it would rescind some of the requirements of the initial RMP amendments, right? So the RMP amendments would apply new requirements on industry. The delay rule pushed off the enforcement dates of those, and the reconsideration rule would roll back a number of the requirements that were put out there by the RMP amendments. Now, it wasn't a full repeal, but a number of the substantive provisions were proposed for repeal. All right, so we have all of these rules out there. We've got enforcement delayed because of the delay rule. In the middle of all this, the litigation proceeds, and in August of 2018, effective in September 2018, the DC Circuit vacated the delay rule. So if you're building a tower out of these rules, the DC Circuit just yanks the middle rule out and left only the two bookends. The DC Circuit ruled basically that it was outside EPA's authority to do that. That the delay rule did nothing to advance the goals that EPA was tasked with advancing, so protecting human health and the environment. And so the basis of the decision was that EPA wasn't doing what EPA is supposed to do when they issued that rule. All right, so with that decision, everything got thrown into a little bit of an uproar. We're without a delay rule, so as mentioned, the other two rules are in place, or the amendments were in place, and the reconsideration rule had been proposed. So with the delay rule pulled out, the RMP amendments went into effect, and purportedly immediately, but by December of 2018, EPA had published the RMP amendments in the Code of Federal Regulations, which really is the last official step of making it real law. So where do we stand right now? Well, we stand with the RMP amendments in effect. They have been published. EPA is authorized to enforce those rules. All right, what are the, earlier we talked about, we flagged some of the substantive requirements of the RFP amendments. I'll apologize for any background noise that you've got, or there's someone having a celebration outside our window. All right, so which of the requirements are now in effect? We have the list right up here. If you look at these, you'll see that these largely focus on the emergency response requirements, as well as incident investigations, and then also a training requirement for supervisors. What's missing from this list right now is are the things related to compliance audits and PHAs. So those are going to be a little bit more of the burdensome requirements, and they had a longer phase-in time for their implementation. So moving on. Oh, here we go. We've got a few more. The amendments that are now in effect, the compliance audits, that rule is still in effect. You are still required to do your every three-year compliance audit. There's the pieces particularly related to third-party involvement. That's not in effect yet. All right, a couple more here related to incident investigations. The number 9 here, the continuous obligation to keep PSI up to date. Nominally, this existed before, but it's got a little bit more teeth under the RMP amendments with the sort of explicitly stated requirement that you must have everything up to date all the time, no matter what. All right, so that's what's in effect. Here is the list of the requirements that I mentioned that will come into effect in the future. These are some of the substantive requirements. So safer technology and alternatives analysis for PHAs, third-party auditor provisions, the root cause element of incident investigations, and then some of the emergency response exercise and public info sharing. Those will go into effect March 15, 2021. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll remember that there's a reconsideration rule out there that purports to strike down these things. We'll come around to the specific timeline on that in just a minute. Here's a list of the major sections of the RMP amendments that would be rolled back if the RMP reconsideration rule is finalized as it was proposed. You can see right here that most of the substantive things, the major things that I mentioned just moments ago, are on this list. Safer technology and alternatives analysis, third-party audits, information sharing, some of the incident investigation updates, 3-year compliance audit requirement to cover all RMP elements, the keeping PSI up-to-date requirement. All of those things are on the chopping block and may be removed from the rule. Now, what's happening with the reconsideration rule? All right, we mentioned that in May 2018, they proposed the reconsideration rule. They closed the comment period in August. In October of last year, we heard from Stephen Cook at our Process Safety Summit here in Washington, D.C., that the agency was working on the reconsideration rule, was pushing it forward, and was hoping to finalize it in first quarter 2019. As I mentioned, it's a sort of a slow motion car accident. We sat and we waited and we waited and we waited. And in September 2019, we saw that the reconsideration rule went to OMB. That's one of the final steps for the publication. And in October of this year, just last month, we were fortunate enough to have Stephen back at our second annual Process Safety Summit. And he said, yes, we're still working on this. We missed our goal of first quarter 2019, but we are going to get it done before the end of December 2019. Now, that may or may not be some wishful thinking, but with the movement of the rule over to OMB, it does seem certain that we are much further along in this process, and it is actually becoming likely that you may see it. So what does it all mean? Where are we at? What happens now? Assuming that EPA publishes the reconsideration rule in the upcoming months, it is a virtual certainty that there will be litigation to challenge it. We expect that litigation will probably mimic the litigation that happened for the delay rule, right? The arguments from the the activist groups will be very similar. They'll argue that EPA is not doing its job, that EPA isn't in the business of rolling back requirements. They're supposed to be doing things to protect the environment and human health. So, you know, we would expect to see some defenses from EPA arguing that the RMP amendments weren't effective or wouldn't have been effective, that they may be too costly, and that they'll be on the hook for explaining why the analysis changed between 2016 and 2018 with the differences in the rules. So stay tuned for all of that. The publication of the rule won't be the end of things, and do watch that. We're going to be fascinated watching this whole thing roll out. In the meantime, if you are in an RMP regulated facility, what do? The answer is all of the RMP amendments that are with effective implementation dates are in effect right now. You don't have to worry about the 2021 effective dates yet, but everything else is currently in effect. EPA has published some compliance guidance, but nothing that's clear enough to say, yes, we will enforce these rules pending the reconsideration rule, or no, we won't. If you talk to an EPA person in the administration, they will tell you they have the authority to enforce the RMP amendments. They tend to express some reluctance about it, but we're fairly certain that reluctance does not extend to all of the field personnel, particularly when you get up to the regional offices. The ones that typically run the enforcement actions, we think that you're likely to see some enforcement actions. It might be on the soft side of enforcement, wherein they may not be issuing notices of violations, but they are pushing employers to comply with the RMP amendments as written that are in effect right now. And that's where it stands. I wish I had a better story or a better resolution for those of you whose job it is to respond to this and to ensure compliance with the rules, but that's where we stand. So stay tuned, and we will keep you all updated on things as they develop. With that, I will turn things over to my colleague, Bita Lashkari.
Great. Thanks so much, Micah. So I will now go over OSHA PSM reform and the CSB reporting rule. So starting with PSM rulemaking. So in the same way that EPA did in 2016, as a result of the explosion in West Texas, OSHA also started making changes to its PSM rule, which RMP is really modeled after. But unlike EPA, as Micah just went through, OSHA did not get as far in the process, which was really quite surprising since it was expected that EPA would follow OSHA, since OSHA is really the lead agency in this field. But in any case, the agency did take some steps towards PSM reform. And in the summer of 2016, OSHA completed its SBREFA, or Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act process, and gathered comments on how the rulemaking might impact small businesses. And during that process, OSHA identified about 20 issues that it said it might address in the rulemaking. And some of those are listed on the table you see on the slide here. Unsurprisingly, there was also considerable overlap with EPA's RMP rulemaking. And that made sense because the two regulations are designed to parallel and complement one another. So then things changed. PSM reform rulemaking moved from active to the long-term actions list on Trump's first regulatory and deregulatory agenda, which was issued in July 2017. This agenda identifies new and canceled rulemaking and what it means for an item to move from active to long-term. As Lisa Long, the director of OSHA's Standard and Guidance Office, explained during the second annual Process Safety Summit in DC put on by our firm, is that things are basically on hold. Lisa said that OSHA is processing the RFI, the request for our information and SBREFA comments, and is in talks with EPA about EPA's RMP rulemaking, which will likely drive OSHA's next action, but she indicated that OSHA does not expect a next step or to reach another milestone like a notice of proposed rulemaking during this administration. So what this means is don't expect much to change with PSM anytime soon. Okay, moving on to the CSB reporting rule. So as you all know, there are reporting obligations under OSHA regulations. Employers must report any worker fatality within 8 hours and any amputation, loss of an eye, or hospitalization within 24 hours. There are also reporting obligations for certain leaks and releases of hazardous substances or oil spills, and those must be reported to the National Response Center, or the NRC. But earlier, so one thing that's always been contemplated is what about the CSB? What kind of reporting obligations do employers have to report incidents to the CSB? Earlier this year, in February 2019, a D.C. District Court judge ordered the CSB to promulgate within a year final reporting rule regulations. So what that means is that before February 2020, which is coming up pretty soon, we should see some kind of final rule for employers to report incidents to the CSB. And just to quote some language, the judge specifically called out the Clean Air Act's language that requires the CSB to establish, by regulation, requirements for reporting accidental releases into the ambient air, which would be subject to the CSB board investigatory jurisdiction. And there was a lot of language that, it was about 30 years ago, and I think, CSB tried to advance an argument that, it hasn't been that long, but I don't think you can argue with 30 years. So the agency originally intended to appeal the decision, but dropped its appeal earlier this summer. So what this means for employers is basically that they can add the CSB on its list of agencies that it must call when it has a qualifying incident. And at the second annual Process Safety Summit, my former colleague and CSB Associate General Counsel Tamara Qureshi said that the agency expects to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking this month. Nothing yet so far, but we're keeping an eye on it. It's going to be, as Micah mentioned, with RMP rulemaking, these things take some time. So we'll see if we can get to a final rule by February 2020, but probably wouldn't take a bet on it.
And one of the interesting things to look out for here, and one of the points that I think CSB was effectively making in discussions about the rule, is that there are so many other avenues where reports of incidents like this are already made, right? The NRC, to OSHA, to EPA, things like that. My expectation is that they will try to craft a rule that takes advantage of some of the existing reporting tools that are already out there and tries to, minimize additional burden, minimize duplication. It will be fascinating to see what they come up with, and we were half expecting that rule to drop, yesterday or the day before, just to make our job a little bit harder here, but we've got our eyes peeled for that as well.
Right. So, if an employer is already required to report an incident to OSHA or something, will the CSB require it to report to CSB as well? So that's absolutely something, we want to look into, that we'll keep an eye out for. One other thing to keep in mind, though, is that, where with OSHA, when you have, some kind of reporting obligation, you can expect some kind of follow-up. With the CSB, really historically, it's always really been focused on major incidents because the agency just doesn't have the manpower, the nationwide coverage that OSHA does. So it'll be interesting, too, to see if that impacts, what would qualify for them as a triggering event, or whether they would not consider that at all. All right, so with that, I will pass it on to Eric, who will speak about expanding PSM coverage.
Thank you. Yes, this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, we spent, the last few days and nights working hard on our briefing to the 10th Circuit in the Wynnewood case. And so, frankly, this is the last thing I want to be talking about right now, although it is timely. But also as, the representative of the employer in this appeal, there are limits to what we can talk about. So what I'd like to do here is just give you sort of a little background about the case that's all publicly available, a little status report about what's going on in the case, and just identify some of the issues, whether associated with the case or not, that are just sort of ways that OSHA now is trying to expand PSM coverage. And this is, in this enforcement action, sort of exemplifies that effort, but it's certainly not a limit to it or the exclusive, instance of OSHA's effort. So, I mean, this is sort of symbolic of what OSHA has been trying to do. I mean, it's sort of interesting, and the timing of this is interesting as well. There was the West fertilizer explosion, and President Obama's executive order that sort of mandated that all of these agencies that have some role in managing chemical safety around the country do something. Modernize your regulatory and regulations and policies to improve chemical safety in the country. And so EPA, because it has the ability to move quickly in rulemaking, did what Micah described for you. OSHA doesn't have that ability. I mean, if you watch sort of OSHA's rulemaking and sort of the history of OSHA rulemaking, it's somewhere between a dozen years and eternity to finalize a rule. And so it's no wonder that they barely started down the checklist for PSM reform by the time EPA had published a final rule. But I think OSHA took seriously President Obama's executive order, and they're doing things outside the realm of formal rulemaking to try to, what they call, or what President Obama asked for, was to modernize the way we manage and regulate chemical safety. And they were, finding ways to expand their reach, to expand the processes, the type of equipment, the employers, the chemicals that are covered by the PSM standard, and then applying expansive interpretation letters about what is reg-a-gap, what's not reg-a-gap, what is, all these different elements of, the retail exemption they tried to revisit with an interpretation letter. All these different ways, short of actually amending the PSM standard to expand the reach of PSM. And this is one, I think, really, really critical example is what they have endeavored to do in this refinery case. This case involved an explosion of a steam boiler that its sole purpose was to heat up water and make steam to be used out around the refinery. It did not reside in the boundaries of any covered process, but it served a lot of different covered processes. The incident occurred. It did not affect any PSM covered process. It did not mitigate the ability to respond to an incident in a covered process. It did not cause a release of HHC from any vessel. It didn't damage any equipment inside of a covered process. But nevertheless, OSHA issued a series of PSM citation items, all related to implementation of the PSM elements as directly involving the boiler, the process of the boiler. And what OSHA did was they said that this boiler is part of those other covered processes to which it is connected, which frankly is essentially every process inside of a refinery uses utility steam, and so they're all connected in some way, shape, or form. So OSHA issued all these PSM citations. One interesting element here that's not PSM, but it's kind of, I think, fascinating, is that OSHA characterized most of the PSM citations as repeat violations. And the reason they did that was a prior owner and operator of this, footprint refinery had received PSM violations in the past involving processes that were, not disputably PSM covered, the operation of your alky unit, PSM violations there. And now OSHA is citing a new owner and operator of the refinery that had just acquired the refinery, less than a year before the explosion at issue in the case, and characterized the violations as repeat, even though it was now a utility steam boiler, theoretically connected through interconnection or co-location, which is the issues in the case, and not a traditionally on its own PSM covered process, and is a different entity. And so the question became whether it was the same employer, one of the elements of a repeat violation, that it's a prior violation and become a final order of the review commission, and a substantially similar violation by the same employer occurs. So a big dispute arose as to whether this was the same employer for purposes of a repeat violation. On appeal, so the ALJ affirmed the PSM citations, finding that this boiler was part of a PSM covered process because it was interconnected with and located near enough, proximate enough, to be considered co-located with other covered processes at the facility. On appeal to the Review Commission upheld the application of the PSM standard to the boiler, but rejected the repeat characterization. In its decision, the Review Commission, I think, tread some, fairly remarkable new ground, and, we think in a way that was not supported by the law, but they applied some interpretations of the PSM standard that, justify covering this boiler. And there were three major interpretations that they applied. One is that a group of vessels that may be treated as a single process. There's a definition in the of process in the PSM standard that applies to a group of vessels. A covered process is a single vessel, or it can be a group of vessels that are interconnected or co-located or located near enough to each other such that a highly hazardous chemical could be involved in a release from a common incident. And that's me paraphrasing the definition. And it has always been understood since the PSM standard was promulgated that condition, that an incident involving one vessel could cause an effect on the other vessel for these triggers to apply, for interconnection or co-location to apply. And the Review Commission in this case, OSHA argued and the Review Commission accepted that provision, that there needs to be some sort of potential causal link, an incident involving one vessel causing a potential release from another vessel, only applies, that condition only applies to co-located vessels, vessels that are located near each other but not connected. That condition does not apply to interconnected, the interconnected component of the definition. So what that means, in short, is if there is any connection, any physical connection at all, and the Review Commission considered, indirect physical connections, a steam boiler that generates steam that runs through a pipe, that connects to a header, that runs through another pipe, that eventually connects with a vessel in a downstream PSM covered process. That is a physical connection, and that alone is enough to trigger the interconnected language in the definition of process in the PSM standard. And if you, understand how, modern petroleum refineries or complex chemical facilities operate, you realize that in a general sense, everything is connected, right? From water lines to, fuel gas lines to steam lines to electrical cables. There is no way that you could find some meaningful equipment inside of one of these sophisticated facilities that is not indirectly physically connected to everything else inside the fence line. So if that interpretation carries the day, and that's right now what the Review Commission, how they interpret the PSM standard, say goodbye to process boundaries, because everything is connected and therefore everything is part of a single process, and therefore if any part of that is PSM covered, if you hit the threshold quantity in any part of that facility, then everything is PSM covered. I mean, that is the sort of, if you run that interpretation to its extreme, that's the reality. So that was the one, most significant, in my opinion, element of the Review Commission's decision. The other two interpretations were, one was that there is no requirement that when you're talking about interconnected or co-located vessels for applying this, coverage analysis, that there's no requirement that the vessels contain highly hazardous chemicals. That you could literally have a vessel that contains water that is connected to an otherwise PSM-covered process. Well, that water-containing vessel, according to the Review Commission's interpretation, is part of a single process. And if that single process is PSM covered, then they're all PSM covered. So, if you've got a common water line that runs from the water fountain in your admin building, and the same water system provides utility water to a covered process, well, now your water fountains in your admin building are covered because there's no requirement that a highly hazardous chemical be contained or capable of being contained in one of these vessels. Another, we think, plainly wrong interpretation, but one that will have significant impact on how PSM is enforced going forward. And then the final interpretation was the standard does talk about that causal link, that there needs to be, an incident involving the co-located vessel, we think both interconnected and co-located vessel, that an incident involving that vessel must be able to have some effect on the other vessels for these triggers to apply. Well, the guidance out there says that it needs to be a reasonable probability that an incident involving one would affect the other. And the Review Commission said, well, I don't see the word reasonable in the plain text of the standard, so it's not there, so it doesn't apply. So there's nothing about reasonable likelihood of one event causing a release from another vessel. All that matters is any imaginable scenario. And that is literally how they decided this case, that pure rank speculation about how something might impact another vessel was enough for PSM coverage of the steam boiler. So, that's a lot of talk about something that I was kind of tired of thinking about over the last few days. But, some key takeaways from this case. I mean, this is, OSHRC really gifted to OSHA a long-standing desire that OSHA had to expand PSM coverage. And really, I think they went to the extreme here in their interpretation to expand it, from my perspective, to everything within the fence line. And given OSHRC's decision, OSHA can now, if they wanted to in their enforcement discretion, issue PSM citation or evaluate compliance with PSM for all sorts of stuff that we've all sort of understood for the last, 30 years to not be covered by the PSM standard. Things like, boilers, cooling towers, water towers. And then, obviously, I can't imagine OSHA is going to go out and say, where's your mechanical integrity inspection program for your water fountains and toilets in the admin building? But technically, they could. They're not going to, but that's how you would read this new expansion that they've been gifted. This is important, obviously for a lot of reasons, but I think it's particularly important when you consider the timing. Amanda is going to talk in a little bit about OSHA's nationwide chemical facilities and petroleum refining PSM national emphasis program that is now wrapped up its second year and is growing every year. So we're in the middle of this national emphasis program that allows OSHA to go into PSM covered facilities, ammonia facilities, or facilities that have only an ammonia covered process, and refineries and chemical plants. Anybody covered by the PSM standard is effectively open to a programmed inspection. So even if you don't have incidents, no employee complaints, you may still be visited by OSHA, and they're doing hundreds and hundreds of these PSM NEP inspections every year. Now, with this gift from the Review Commission, unless the 10th Circuit beats them back, which we hope they will, they're doing all these inspections with a pretty expansive new interpretation of PSM application. So I think folks need to consider how to deal with that, right? We know what OSHA's opinion is. OSHA's opinion is interconnection is a broad concept. We know now that they are applying it to things like boilers and utilities equipment. So you need to consider how to handle that, and whether that's changing your own PSM coverage assessments or What a lot of employers do is to voluntarily apply PSM elements to things that you consider to be non-PSM. So if OSHA shows up and you have a fight about it, you can still maintain, we believe it's not covered, but in any event, we address it in our compliance audit. We did a PHA in this area. We have operating procedures, which, I mean, you have all this stuff anyway. So, you know, at least try to do an effective job of characterizing it as meeting the PSM elements, because we know what OSHA thinks now, and they've got some cover for what we think are pretty novel and wrong legal interpretations about that. And then the other thing is, let's watch out for other areas where OSHA may try to expand. We're hearing about cases right now involving, you know, terminals. We know that OSHA hates the MIR decision, and they hate the retail exemption, and they hate, you know, all these things that limit their ability to enforce PSM all over the place. You know, they're probably feeling pretty emboldened right now, so I'd watch out for, you know, other areas of expansion of PSM as well. The case is on appeal of the 10th Circuit. The refinery's opening brief was filed literally in the middle of the night last night. The government will reply to the PSM coverage elements in about a month and brief for the first time the successorship repeat same employer issue. The refinery will then, out in probably February, file its brief on the successorship repeat same employer issue. Amicus briefs are, I mean, we're almost certain that they will be filed by interested industry groups on the PSM coverage issue. And there'll be oral arguments sometime in 2020, maybe this summer, and a decision possibly by the end of 2020 or early in 2021. And it's a big, important case, and we hope that we're successful. A major issue, God, even less than wanting to talk about this coverage issue, I want even less to talk about agency deference. But we include it here because this was a major aspect of the arguments in this case. The Supreme Court, well, late last year, I don't know, okay, it was earlier this year, this summer, issued a decision in Kaiser v. Wilkie. And the Supreme Court was revisiting in Kaiser v. Wilkie major issues of agency deference. Our deference means if an agency you know, provides a reasonable interpretation of its own regulation. So if OSHA provides a reasonable interpretation of a OSHA regulation, there is within some framework, courts are required to defer to their reasonable interpretation. This concept of deference has been under attack for a while. There are a lot of judges, high-profile judges, and now high-profile Supreme Court justices who are openly hostile to any level of agency deference. They say, hey, look, we're judges. We are the courts. It is our job to interpret the law, and there is nothing special about this regulation versus any other legal issue that we interpret. It's our providence. We are not going to cede our authority to an agency. But for the time being, agency deference is still the law. But in the Kaiser case, really remarkable decision by the Supreme Court that basically had an opportunity to literally overturn our deference and say there is no more deference to agencies for interpretations of their regulations. They didn't go that far, unfortunately, but they did go pretty far. And what they did, and it was across the board. I mean, actually, Justice Kagan, one of the Democratic-appointed justices, wrote for the court and said, "We're not overturning our deference, but we're going to really put some serious limits on it." And the limits that they put on it were that before you defer to an agency, before you give deference to an agency's interpretation of its own regulation, the regulation needs to be genuinely ambiguous. Because if we as a court can interpret the regulation by its text, by its structure, by its purpose, and by the regulatory history around the regulation, and we can, using those tools, really understand what the regulation means, then we're not going to defer to the agency. We're going to apply that plain meaning with our own judgment. And then even if we still find it ambiguous after that rigorous review of the regulation, we still may not give deference to an agency regulation if certain other criteria are met, one being if the agency's interpretation conflicts with a prior interpretation of the agency, then the interpretation is entitled to either less or no deference. And then, of course, if the interpretation is unreasonable, it's not entitled to deference. Those were major, major issues in this case that we are arguing, because our theory is that the PSM standard, if you look at it in context with the preamble, interpretation letters, the compliance directive, prior interpretations issued by OSHA, contemporaneous or nearly contemporaneous with the issuance of the rule, then it is clear the rule means what we say it means and not what OSHA and OSHRC have decided it means this year. So that was a big, big part of this case that's on appeal now. So I'm not going to get into the facts of it. That's enough about deference. So other ways that OSHA is expanding PSM coverage, Bita is going to talk about some new interpretations issued this year.
Great, thanks, Eric. So, okay, so staying with the expansion of PSM coverage, as Eric mentioned, I'll be talking about a couple of recent letters of interpretation, or LOIs, that OSHA issued within the last year. The first one is this one from June 28th, 2019, regarding containers of consumer aerosol products, things like shaving cream, hairspray, and such. So OSHA said in this LOI that PSM applies if the aggregate weight of flammable gas propellant in stored containers of consumer aerosol products in a distribution center exceeds 10,000 pounds. And OSHA explained its reasoning, saying that flammable gas propellants, substances like butane, isobutane, and propane, are PSM-covered highly hazardous chemicals. That's the first reason. Then they went on to say that if the aggregate exceeds 10,000 pounds, it meets the threshold quantity, and that's even if the chemicals are stored in small containers. And the reasoning for that is because they are co-located. So as Eric just mentioned with Wynnewood, this idea of co-location, how far is OSHA going to push that? It will be really interesting to see post-appeal of Wynnewood what kind of limits, if any, are put on that. But so far as containers of consumer aerosol products, they are considering that even in a distribution center to be considered co-located. And the last one of the last reasons they gave was that there is covered activity. They gave, for example, forklift movement in a distribution center. So that's how OSHA sort of reasoned its letter of interpretation that PSM would apply in these circumstances. In the LOI, OSHA also described how it would expect employers to calculate the weight of the flammable gas propellants in each individual can. So if you're thinking, well, I've got, containers of consumer aerosol products in a DC of mine, how do I even go about, calculating how much flammable gas propellant is in each of those cans to aggregate to a 10,000 pound threshold quantity? OSHA at least gave some guidance as to how it would and how it would expect employers to make that calculation. The agency also recognized that the number of cans may fluctuate substantially within a year or within a season, and that might affect threshold quantity. Even though it recognized that, OSHA said that it does not consider such short periods when the threshold quantity is not met as affecting or as eliminating PSM coverage. OSHA cited to an earlier LOI and clarified that employers must institute control measures to keep their inventories below the threshold quantity in order to eliminate PSM coverage. So those short periods in between where you might be dipping below the threshold quantity, OSHA would not look to that as eliminating PSM coverage. Rather, you would have to institute control measures to keep the inventories below the threshold quantity. So moving on to the next recent PSM LOI, this one was issued on December 19th, 2018, and it clarified the limits of an enforcement stay for oil and gas production. In particular, OSHA said that production facilities that recover nat gas may have enforceable PSM-covered processes. In particular, the LOI describes a couple scenarios involving nat gas processes in the production phase versus extraction. So the first scenario is processing is typically conducted at or near a wellhead that either, one, has no gathering system available for receipt of the associated gas stream, or two, has an available nat gas gathering system to connect to, but the owner of the gathering system will not accept the production facility gas streams or liquid volumes. So that was the first scenario. And then the second scenario is that processing is conducted in facilities where multiple lines of the gathering system connect, and that's to prepare the product for the gathering pipeline by reducing the amounts of liquids and system contaminants. So what did OSHA say in this LOI? Basically, the LOI clarified that while there is an enforcement stay for PSM in oil and gas production, that enforcement policy applies only to facilities in SIC codes that were not covered by an economic analysis in the original PSM rulemaking. And OSHA clarified that SIC 1321, which is for natural gas liquids, that was covered by the PSM economic analysis. So facilities that recover NGLs may have enforceable PSM-covered processes where they contain a threshold quantity of 10,000 pounds of flammable gases or liquids. OSHA also recommended in the LOI that facilities consult with EPA on the applicability of RMP to such processes. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda, who will talk about the NEP.
Great. Thank you so much, Beta. And also, just so I can change the slides, if you can change, I think I'm in read-only mode to switch the slide.
Sure, no problem, Amanda.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Excellent. Let's start off by, it's been mentioned several times, the PSM National Emphasis Program. OSHA has had a PSM-focused NEP since the one that I remember it kind of starting after the Texas City BP case. There was one that was put into place as a result of that incident, and it was focused exclusively on refineries, and it was a pretty heavy-duty directive. They went through and talked about what they thought that they would expect to see at client sites, and it kind of gave employers a roadmap. Since that point in time, OSHA's had several different iterations of PSM-focused NEPs. There was a separate one that came out after the refinery that was just focused on chemical facilities that are covered as part of the PSM program or covered under the PSM standard. And then most recently, they've kind of merged the chemical refinery and the chemical facilities and the refineries into one NEP. And interestingly enough, the existing NEP that combines both the chemical facilities and the refinery came out in January of 2017. I think it was the final week before there was an administration change, and probably one of the most productive weeks in OSHA history. There was a variety of final rules and directives and other guidance that came out that week, and this was one of them. We didn't really know what would happen with the directive as a new set of political leaders came into place, and there was kind of a quiet lull, and they were in outreach mode to the regulated community before they started actually going out and conducting programmed inspections. But it has continued to exist. This administration has continued to implement it and conducted inspections under it. And those inspections started in the spring of 2008. let's see, I'm still having problems. Perfect, next slide. OSHA advertised this new NEP, PSM-focused NEP for chemical facilities and refineries, a little bit different than their initial one back in 2005 or 2006 as a result of the BP Texas City incident. This was going to be, and these are OSHA's own words, kind of a pop quiz style inspection rather than the final exam that was going on during the initial refinery PSM NEPs. And there would only be one co-show rather than a team of multiple co-shows showing up, anywhere from 4 to 6 co-shows coming on site during the refinery PSM NEP and being there for a pretty good duration during the 6-month statute of limitations, asking where they could set up, what office they could use. Certainly not seeing that under the Chem Ref PSM NEP. OSHA found the initial PSM-focused NEPs for refineries to be rather intensive. I think that I recall hearing one number that maybe there was 40 times the amount of man-hours spent on that, and OSHA was just finding that they could not continually keep that up. So they were looking for an alternative way to go into the PSM-covered facilities without spending so many resources. So this is kind of the scaled-down version. They're focusing on one process rather than 3. They have great discretion in picking that process. A lot of times they'll ask to see what incidents have happened in the last 5 years. If you've had to report anything to EPA, that unit is usually a particular interest of OSHA, but OSHA does have great discretion in picking that unit. Prior to, or when these NEPs first started, we were seeing thousands and thousands of pages requested. PHA, the initial PHA, maybe 2 or 3, and now we're seeing more of a spot check. And even at times, OSHA just kind of taking a look at the documents and not even requesting copies and studying them. There's no pre-inspection questionnaire document request. A lot of times when they would come in under the refinery PSM, we would get a sheet. It was a form created by the national office setting forth a list of documents. It was rather large. It included audits. It might include MOCs, a subset of MOCs. They would start with an MOC list and then pick ones off there to review. Just certainly much more dialed back than what we were seeing about over 10 years ago, 10, 12, 15 years ago. They currently have a shorter dynamic list that OSHA develops in the national office, and this is a list that they do not make public, and it supposedly changes on a certain interval. So they can keep the public guessing, and OSHA feels like it's a bit more of a pop quiz than having the refineries or the covered entities study for the final exam. And one other thing that we're seeing with this is more collaboration between federal agencies. There's been some communication between EPA RMP reps with OSHA regarding what they're finding at particular sites. And so that's not always something that we've seen collaboration between federal agencies, but it seems to be more prevalent nowadays. Next slide.
I moved it, Amanda.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was waiting for it to move and I didn't see it. The national office, generally under the current REF or Chem Ref NEP, they create a list, as they do for most of their national emphasis programs, and then divide it up by region. Each region has a certain number of targets that they're supposed to go in and conduct a planned inspection at. Of course, the regions that have more PSM-covered facilities would have a higher number. There is a priority for refineries in this list ranking that's being put together by the national office. And as part of the current NEP, that OSHA required adoption by state plans. Now, OSHA doesn't require all emphasis programs to be required by state plans, but this one in particular was required to be adopted by them. And we're also seeing that contractors are included in the inspections, asking for their training documentation and other information. This is what we're currently seeing with regards to PSM inspections. Next slide, please. This is a breakdown of data that is from fiscal year 2018, which the federal fiscal year ends in the end of September, and then we've got some preliminary numbers from the most recent completed fiscal year 2019. You'll see that the total number of Fed OSHA PSM inspections that are marked as ChemRef in the database is roughly the same. So when we consider the 179 plus the 59, we're about at 238, a few more than what we saw in fiscal year 2018, but OSHA considers any inspection started during the fiscal year 2019 gets tagged with that year. So some of those are still ongoing due to the 6-month statute of limitation. So we'll have comparable numbers once these numbers kind of filter out and become more finalized for fiscal year 2019. And then we will see, programmed inspections, unprogrammed inspections. That additional 59 inspections will be broken down further. In compliance rate, 33%, slightly lower, but that might change once we have final numbers in for FY 2019, and that's fairly consistent what we see with all OSHA inspections with regards to compliance. No data yet coming in with regards to the number of hours spent on inspections, and a slight uptick based on what we're seeing now on these preliminary numbers in the number of citations issued per inspection. It jumped to 4.4 from 2.9, and then the penalty number is a little higher in fiscal year 2019, but a lot of those cases probably have not been resolved, and the number for fiscal year 2018 is final disposition, what the employer ended up paying after there was a settlement agreement or some other resolution. So the penalty amount you're seeing in fiscal year 2019 is as issued. So that number will most likely, I can't imagine that it would not be lowered. So those numbers will be lowered if you're looking at that number. As I did earlier today, and I couldn't figure out why there would be such a sudden increase in the number of penalties from these fiscal year 2018 to 19. But those $4.51 million is not the final disposition, and so that number will become lower as some of these cases settle out. So these are preliminary information for fiscal year 2019 that will continue to be updated and be refined as more information becomes available. Next slide. The same, here's a list of the refineries that have experienced a PSM audit, a ChemRef PSM audit, since the recent PSM emphasis program went into place. There's a couple open ones, getting some, a lot of them concentrated in the Texas area, Region 6, but seeing a couple more outside of that region as well, Region 2 in New Jersey, for example. These are the ones that have been opened. This is something that is tracked here by ConMaciel in consultation with an association, so we keep pretty close tabs on that and look at it in the IMIS database. Going to the next slide, the top 5 cited PSM provisions remain pretty stable consistently.
Amanda, just wanted to add one point from Eric, is that we're also interviewing these refineries.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive data collection effort. We're interviewing them about, compliance officers, man-hours spent, subject matters, units selected, collecting document requests, doing all sorts of things to try to put some predictability around inspections under this program, or at least inspections at refineries under this program. And that's been an effort that's been underway for about a year, and we're, gathering a lot of data and trying to organize it in a meaningful way right now.
Excellent. Next slide. So as I was saying before, the citations that we're seeing coming out of these emphasis programs focused on PSM remain largely the same top 5. Mechanical integrity tops the list, followed by process safety information, and both of those rely heavily on ragged gap issues as far as underground piping, the data, the intervals, the information or pieces of equipment are being inspected, and then we see PHA, operating procedures, and management and change filling out the top 5. Those have pretty consistently, even going back for a number of years, remained kind of the ranking for violations. Moving on to the next slide. One of the changes that was recently brought up that Jeff Wanko, who oversees the enforcement aspect of the PSM programs, is that we're seeing different results. They still remain to be the same top five cited provisions within the PHA standard, but not seeing as many overall instances of each violation, which is a good thing, indicating that, you know, maybe we're getting compliance officers are becoming more proficient, maybe employers are kind of learning or getting accustomed what OSHA is expecting, but overall seeing fewer violations under the Big 5, even though they continue to be the most heavily cited for these inspections. A couple more facts about the KIM-REF NEP, going on to the next slide. As with any OSHA inspection, there's generally no advance notice that's written into their statute. We have heard of one employer who did get 48-hour notice, but that is really rare and unusual. So the primary is you don't know that OSHA is going to be there to conduct an emphasis program inspection until they're knocking at your door. And they'll usually walk in and kind of start off by having an opening conference and setting the ground rules, and you'll get a flavor of the expectations there. Usually only a handful of visits to the field. OSHA compliance officers might show up the first day, indicate that they'll be back in a week or two after you've done some data collection. They've asked for some documentation. Others might have a more consistent presence there on the work site. It has really run the gamut, but generally we're seeing more dropping in, come and go style of inspections with COSHAs, visiting more frequently at start of inspection, and then disappearing and returning sporadically for months. Those times when they're not on site, we're seeing a lot of email inquiries asking for documentation or clarification on information provided. Although there have been the circumstances where an inspector's been on site for up to 90 days. So it really depends. I would say that the instances where we're seeing inspectors on site consistently would be more of the instances where there's been a pretty significant event, maybe a fatality-related event. That inspection would also be tagged as a KIM-REF PSM NEP, so it's not your typical spot check. We're also seeing that local inspectors are relying on experts, either at the regional offices or in Salt Lake City. Very engaged in the process, especially in some of the regions that don't do as much PSM work, like up in the Boston area. Heavy reliance on the technical experts that are in the Salt Lake City technical office for OSHA. A lot of correspondence and even getting them involved in telephone interviews asking about the process. Generally, only one process unit is being selected at the start of the inspection. There have been instances where it's expanded to others, but typically it does stay around one. Focus on the actual process. They are not going and looking at tank farms or piping for the most part. They're really focusing on the process. Next slide. Typically, employee interviews, part of a general OSHA inspection, they're being represented here in the KIM-REF PSM NEP. The approximate number of employees, it really, could be 5 to 15. We've heard stories that 50-plus employees were involved in one site inspection. This goes to show that there's a wide variety in the intensity that compliance officers apply to each inspection, which is pretty usual. It can either be because of the severity of the incident, or the history of the company, or a particular COSHA's interest. I will say that they're currently got time limitations on their, upon the COSHA's just because of the shortage of them, but there's wide discretion on how focused they want to be on a particular inspection, and that can be represented through the number of document requests, the number of times to the field, number of employee interviews. One thing that has pretty consistently been monitored or seen throughout these inspections is no air monitoring being conducted. Typically no involvement in the area or regional managers in the inspections. When we said earlier that regional, there might be some folks in regional, there's PSM experts at the regional level and certainly the Salt Lake City, but as far as the managerial type assistant RA or the area director, typically not seeing them engaged in the inspection. No outside experts consulted, but some reliance by the COSHAs on the Salt Lake City experts for document review and interview assistance and interpretations on the process. Heavy emphasis on mechanical integrity and MOCs on all aspects of the inspection. And going on to the next slide. Usually document requests made. Really the documents can vary depending on the intensity of the inspection. One site received 150 document requests. That is certainly an outlier. Typically what we see is a lot less. Typically could start with a broad set of documents, but as with any OSHA request, you can start to whittle that down, tailor it, ask them if you can get them a subset that you think is particularly responsive to what they're looking at, and indicate that you can get them more if what they need is not in that document. COSHAs are more focused on occupational safety, more so than we've seen in past inspections, and no real consistency based on the method of investigation, and that could largely be due to area office, individual COSHA preferences, but a variety of different methods employed, including starting off with very broad, very all-encompassing request, and then trying to narrow it down after they find an incident or an MOC that particularly piques their interest. Others are fishing expeditions and just kind of throwing the ball everywhere and seeing what sticks. Some work backwards to see if they can, they'll find some particular fact or some detail, maybe an employee complaint, and start focusing on that and working backwards to documents that might be relevant. Just really a wide variety of different investigative methods employed. Incidents that occurred within 6 months of the inspection certainly have triggered questioning and possible expansion of the inspection. This is pretty normal, and what we've seen, and we've continued to see that with the PSM, how OSHA is conducting the current ChemRef PSM. Next slide. Unlike most other NEPs and local emphasis programs, this one has no expiration date. Usually OSHA renews emphasis programs on an annual basis to see if they're continually needed, if there's been any changes with regards to numbers that justified its existence in the first place. This one has no expiration date. It's in perpetuity with only minor tweaks. I don't think that this one has been updated since it originally was issued in 2017. One of the reasons that OSHA likes to have these NEPs, especially focused on PSM facilities, is because a lot of times they don't get into these facilities otherwise. They typically have low DART rates, so they're not going to show up on their SST program, which looks at facilities that have high injury rates within their industry. Not many reported incidents, since they're usually low frequency and high consequence, and low rate of employee complaints. So this is one way that OSHA is able to get into these PSM regulated facilities to conduct an inspection. So in a nutshell, it's either OSHA gets into these facilities through a ChemRef PSM NEP targeted inspection, or some sort of inspection that might involve an employee complaint, a fatality, or another catastrophe. And I'm turning the presentation back over to the folks in DC.
Thanks, Amanda. All right, we're getting near the end here with just a couple of things very quickly. I've got a couple slides on RMP, then I'll hand it back over to Eric for a little bit about criminal. We already talked about the RMP rule. Let's talk a little bit about RMP enforcement. You know what OSHA enforcement looks like. Well, EPA has their own sticks to use when it comes to enforcement. One of the nice things when you're dealing with OSHA is that they have a 6-month statute of limitations. It keeps their inspections short, often mercifully so. EPA doesn't have that kind of a limitation on their inspections. They are dealing with a 5-year statute of limitations. So you could have an event, you could have an OSHA citation, you could contest it, you could litigate it, you could get a decision from a judge, finish it all up, and still the next day EPA could probably show up and say, hey, we're going to investigate that incident that you had. So our RMP investigations don't end, or often they don't start very quickly, and they can go on for a long time. EPA has another extra stick there with their penalties, far higher than what is available to OSHA, up to nearly $100,000 per day for each violation. Depending on how they're set up, it can be anywhere from 3 to 50 times more than OSHA for the same event. And those numbers are based on notices of violation and citations issued for the same exact incident event, things like that. Given the overlap between RMP and EPA's extended statute of limitations, one thing that you have to be careful with when you're dealing with multiple enforcement actions is that information gathered by OSHA developed during an inspection or litigation can be used by EPA later on to bring a more significant enforcement action. We know anything about regulators. They like to have someone do the legwork in gathering things and preparing a case for them. That's why we're always cautious about self-audits and ensuring that those are protected under attorney-client privilege, because OSHA loves to get those. It's a roadmap for where to go. Same is true for EPA. If they can piggyback off an OSHA investigation, OSHA's already done half the hard work. EPA can come in and just jack up the fines. And then finally, EPA has a much wider range of criminal options for RMP violations. The only way you can get a criminal charge for an OSHA violation is when it relates to a fatality, and the maximum charge is a misdemeanor. EPA has access to felonies and misdemeanor charges under their statute. I know you've already talked a little bit about enforcement from the OSHA perspective. Things are similar in the RMP arena. Since 2017, the EPA has issued, has cited RMP provisions in many of its largest enforcement actions. If we thought that RMP enforcement was going to fall off in the Trump administration, unfortunately, that's not accurate. They seem to be continuing it on at about the same pace as they did before during the end of the Obama administration. And EPA has even included RMP in its National Compliance Initiative for the next 4 years. So you can expect to see RMP remaining a top enforcement priority. With that, I'll pass it back over to Eric to round us out.
All right, yeah, we've kept you all for a long time, and we're very tired, so I'm just going to cruise through this real quickly. I mean, we include this section just to say, you know, the consequences for ineffective PSM and RMP implementation have been growing and growing and growing, and in one area where we're seeing significant activity in this space is criminal investigations, criminal prosecutions, criminal outcomes to these incidents. In the OSHA context, there is a criminal provision of the OSH Act that provides for a misdemeanor criminal charge, typically against a company, although it can be, whoa, what's happening here? Sorry, can you all still see the slides? Let's see if I can get that back up. Okay, anyway, the criminal charge is available for a willful violation that causes a worker fatality. Like I said, those are typically misdemeanor charges, as Micah mentioned. So it's been rarely used historically. It's rarely been used in OSHA's history, but there were some big changes that occurred later in the Obama era years that have increased the frequency of either direct OSH Act criminal charges or just any kind of criminal charge related to worker safety incidents. And those arose in the context of what's called the Yates memos. And there were 2 memos that came out from the Department of Justice saying we want to focus on worker safety crimes So we're going to find some creative ways to do that. I mean, one is we're telling you from Main Justice here in Washington, D.C., out to our field offices, we want you to prosecute cases involving worker safety, but they also created some tools to make that more likely, and they also said we want to pursue individual criminal charges rather than corporate criminal charges as a way to incentivize prosecutors taking those cases. The main thing that they did and this is not just in the process safety space, this is at large, a directive from Main Justice that we want to prosecute worker safety. But one of the ways that they went about accomplishing that was to say cases where there is an OSHA, where a worker safety and environmental overlap, let's go after those really hard because we've got really well-trained environmental criminal investigators and environmental criminal prosecutors and sharper teeth, as Micah mentioned a little bit ago. So where is there that kind of overlap with worker safety and environmental criminal issues? Probably nowhere is that Venn diagram closer to a perfect circle than it is in the context of PSM. So if you're operating chemical facilities, petroleum refineries, and you have an incident, a tragic incident, there is a significant risk now that the Department of Justice is going to get serious about that, send in their environmental criminal investigators, and pursue criminal charges in that context, far greater likelihood than we've ever seen in the past. We've got some headlines that we've collected here. Manager at a processing plant that exploded, sentenced for Clean Air Act violations. This one, interestingly, not federal prosecution, but a county prosecution down in Texas. The Harris County DA announces new indictments for a company and one of its vice presidents. A chemical company, criminal convicted of violating the Clean Air Act. Criminal charges filed against a chemical manufacturer for water pollution after a massive tank fire. Former company sentenced after a blast at a wastewater company. Manager pleads guilty in a chemical blast. Former plant owner hit with charges over explosion fire. Man found guilty of Clean Air Act violations. So we've got a slide here with a couple of specific examples, back in 2001 and 2005, so you can see the size of these types of criminal prosecutions when they're brought. There was like a $50 million criminal fine in the BP Texas incident, $10 million fine in another incident involving a tank explosion back in 2001. So these are, obviously much bigger deal than the EPA or OSHA civil enforcement actions. The Arkema case, during that Hurricane Harvey incident where they lost power to keep things cooled or whatever the circumstances were. Despite the CSB finding, OSHA, the company more or less did everything effectively consistent with their plans, and nevertheless, something extraordinarily unforeseeable, the size of the storm and the consequence of the storm happened. Harris County prosecutors went after the company, went after individuals as well. There are indictments out there. That activity is proceeding. Here's the headline there, Harris County and so my point here was, I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet. I don't think we've seen the end of it yet. This was a headline from a few months ago. Harris County hires more prosecutors after huge chemical plant fires. So you got to look out for OSHA. You got to look out for EPA. You've got to look out for the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's offices. You've got to look out now for county prosecutors as well. And we're seeing state and county level prosecutions, not under the OSH Act, but under, involuntary manslaughter type circumstances, or as in these cases here, state criminal prosecution. So, it's a big deal. It's important, obviously, to get process safety and risk management right, for a whole host of reasons, but here's some that we've talked about today. So, I'm excited to invite you to our final webinar of the 2019 OSHA webinar series, coming up in the middle of next month. This is another one of those where I really enjoy, where we team up with our employment law colleagues here at the firm and do an overlapping subject. And next month it'll be workplace violence and sexual harassment issues, the OSHA and employment law issues that impact those two subjects. And then look out soon for an announcement about the 2020 OSHA webinar series. We've worked really hard all year to put on fresh, detailed, interesting presentations about OSHA subjects. And I think hopefully you all agree that we did a good job at that, and we worked really hard at it, and the prize for that really hard work is that we get to do it again, 12 more of them next year. So we hope you join us for those, and in between those webinar events that you're checking out our OSHA blog. I'd love to know that someone's out there reading the stuff that we're putting up on the blog too. Lots of good content there. I don't know that we do have a few questions here. Slides will be sent out within the next couple of days. Everybody that registered for the event will get a copy of the slides and a link to a recording of the event. Let's see, about the 2019 Letter of Interpretation. Does OSHA allow for engineering and or administrative control consideration for determining co-location, like fire-rated cabinets, firewalls, fire suppression systems, etc.? The answer is yes. So I think what you're talking about is the broad new interpretations that are at issue in the Wynnewood case. The analysis for co-location, nobody is advancing an interpretation that says that there's no need for a causal link between co-located vessels. OSHA and OSHRC agree that there needs to be some demonstration that an event involving one vessel can cause an effect, and that effect is supposed to be the effect of a release of highly hazardous chemicals from the other vessel for co-location to be established. And so if you can demonstrate by way of engineering controls or effective administrative controls that there is no, right now the interpretation that they've advanced is any possibility at all that an event involving one co-located vessel can cause a release from the other co-located vessel in that set. We think it's pretty clear that it's about a reasonable probability of such an event happening, but that is part of the analysis. And so absolutely those are the things that we as the employer would be demonstrating, we would be putting forward in a discussion with OSHA or in litigation before the review commission, is to show there is no possibility of an event involving this vessel impacting that vessel because of it's contained in a fire-rated cabinet, or an effective fire-rated wall, or fire suppression system that would kick on well before a temperature that might affect this other vessel could ever be achieved. If you could demonstrate that with, probably, engineering analyses, then yes, you can separate those vessels from a co-location standpoint. Part of the problem with that analysis, though, is, what is this vessel that's going to be co-located that's not also in some way indirectly connected to that vessel? If it's like a, tanker truck that is disconnected from all other vessels, you just attach a hose when you're using it, it otherwise sits there disconnected. I just think it's really hard to avoid that analysis of interconnected now. But if you really are, you've broken that interconnection link, and you're just looking at the co-location, which means it's located so near these other vessels that they should be considered part of a single process, then yes, you absolutely should be able to demonstrate that there is not a possibility that an event involving this can affect that because of these controls. So that's a great question, and that's that's an issue that we're arguing in the case that we've talked about. So thanks for all that, and thanks everybody for joining us today and for joining us all year at these programs. It's been a lot of fun talking with you, and we look forward to doing it again soon.